I've been passionate about this issue ever since I came to know Christ at the end of my first year in the university and began to see that evolution was what I believe one of the greatest myths ever forced on the minds of men. And the idea of millions of years is absolutely critical to the whole idea of evolution. And as I was growing in my understanding of this issue, I began to see that the problem really didn't start with Darwin. It started before that. And that's what led me to do my research, my PhD research. And so I want to talk to you about where the idea of millions of years came from. And before we go into the history, I want us to look at two very important verses of Scripture. One is in 2 Corinthians 10. Paul says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ." So Paul tells us here that we are involved in a war, and it is a war of ideas. It is not a war of bullets and guns and swords. It's a war dealing with truth. And Paul says that this war is a war that involves destroying speculations. Then in Colossians chapter 2, he warns the Colossians, "See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ." Paul is warning the Colossian believers that they could be deceived, that they could be taken captive by philosophy and the traditions of men. And this warning is a serious warning. It's a true warning. And Christians can be taken captive. And as we proceed to look at the historical roots of this issue, we're going to see that that is precisely what has happened. The church has been deceived in a major way. Now, up until about the beginning of the 19th century, the dominant view in Europe, where science was born in the womb of the Christian worldview, the dominant view was the biblical view that God created about 6,000 years ago and in 6 literal days, and that he flooded the world with a global flood. But in the late 18th and early 19th century, new theories of Earth history began to be proposed. And I want to introduce you to 8 of those of the people that were very influential in the development of this idea. It didn't just pop into existence one day. There were several people that were involved in developing the idea of millions of years. And if you're not into history and you don't like names and dates, don't panic, because I will review as I go along, so you'll get the flow of things. But the first person I want to introduce is a man named Comte de Buffon. He was a naturalist in France, and in 1778 he wrote a book called Epics of Nature, in which he argued that the Earth had slowly cooled from a hot, molten lava state over the course of about 78,000 years to become the planet that we live on today. He did some experiments with different kinds of metal balls to see how they cooled, and so he speculated about Earth history and developed this model. Then there was Pierre Laplace. He was an astronomer, also a Frenchman. And in 1796, he wrote Exposition of the System of the Universe, in which he speculated that the universe, and at least our solar system, was once a great gas cloud, a spinning gas cloud, that slowly cooled and condensed by the laws of physics and chemistry to become our solar system. And so we can represent it this way, a giant gas cloud. It became known as the Nebular Hypothesis. And many scientists rejected this idea as it was initially proposed, but it began to work on the minds of people. And so that gas cloud slowly cooled to produce rings like Saturn, and then eventually those became the planets of our solar system. Jean Lamarck was another Frenchman who contributed to this idea. He was a naturalist specializing in shell creatures, and in 1809 he published his Philosophy of Zoology, in which he proposed a theory of biological evolution over long ages based on the principle of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And initially, almost all scientists rejected this notion of biological evolution. The scientists, whether they were Christian or not, believed that God had created the different kinds of creatures. So this was firmly rejected, but it was a forerunner to Darwin's theory. Now, those people weren't really geologists. Now let's consider some of the men in geology. Abraham Werner, or Werner as they would say in German, was a mineralogist in the eastern part of Germany, and he was not a prolific author, but he was an excellent teacher, and many of the 19th century's greatest geologists went and studied under him. And he proposed that the sedimentary rock layers that we see were the result of chemical and physical deposition of a slowly receding global ocean over about a 1,000,000-year period. Now, he only studied the sedimentary rocks. He didn't pay any attention to the fossils in the rocks. Then there was another man about the same time up in Scotland by the name of James Hutton. He was an agriculturalist. He actually studied medicine, but he was a wealthy landowner, and then his real love was geology, and so the latter part of his life he devoted to the study of rocks. He had a different view of Earth history. And in 1795, he published a book, Theory of the Earth, which was based on an article he published 10 years earlier, a journal article, in which he viewed Earth history as cyclical. Just as the heavenly bodies are moving in a circular fashion, so he believed Earth history was cyclical. The continents, as he observed his farmland being eroded into the rivers, and the rivers would take the sediments down to the ocean, he imagined that the continents were gradually being eroded into the ocean, then the internal heat of the earth solidified those sediments and then raised them to become new continents. And so this cycle was just endless. The continents eroding into the oceans, the ocean sediments becoming new continents. And he made a famous statement that he could see no evidence of a beginning in the rock record, a statement that brought the charge of atheism for many of his contemporaries. Now, he didn't pay any attention to the fossils in the rock either, as he speculated about Earth history. But Georges Cuvier was one who did pay attention to the fossils. He was a French comparative anatomist and paleontologist, and worked in France, and specifically in Paris. And he noted that there were different kinds of creatures fossilized in the rock record, and he developed a theory that became known as catastrophism. He believed that over the course of untold ages, there had been many regional or global catastrophic floods that produced the geological record, and that at each of these catastrophes, many or most of the creatures living were made extinct, and then God created new forms of life to replace the creatures that had disappeared in the catastrophe. Then there was William Smith, working in England. He was a drainage engineer and a surveyor, and he was very involved in the building of roads, railroad cuts, and tunnels for the transport of the raw materials and the finished products of the Industrial Revolution. And as he was doing his surveying work, he saw the fossils and the rock layers exposed, and he became fascinated. And he became known as the father of English stratigraphy because he was the one who developed the method of using fossils to give relative dates to the rocks. So he would find a rock layer over here that had certain kind of fossils, and then he would find a rock layer over in another part of England or Wales that had the same fossils, and he concluded, well, those are the same age. And then he began to work with, well, there's different fossils in different layers, and so we can get a relative dating to the rock layers, and that is still a method used today. Then there was Charles Lyell, the last person I want to introduce to you. Lyell built on the ideas of James Hutton, who died the year of Lyell's birth. He insisted that not only were the processes uniform of sedimentation and erosion that Hutton had talked about, but that they had worked at the same rate of energy and intensity and frequency throughout Earth history. And so his theory became known as uniformitarianism, and Earth history became even longer. Now, Lyell is often given, I think, too much credit or blame, depending on how you want to phrase it, for the death of belief in Genesis. But as you can see, the ideas of rejecting the biblical chronology and the biblical flood were already disappearing before he published his books. So let's review then. The old earth theories. Buffon believed in a cooling earth over at least 78,000 years. Historians of science have read his private journals and think that he actually believed the earth was about 1 million years old, but he didn't have the courage to publish that date, and even the 78,000 years was not acceptable to the Roman Catholic Church at that time. Laplace proposed the Nebular Hypothesis for the origin of the solar system over long ages. Lamarck had a biological theory of evolution over long ages. Werner believed that the sedimentary rocks were the result of a receding ocean over about 1 million years. Hutton had a uniformitarian theory. He saw no evidence of beginning in the rock record. Cuvier paid attention to fossils. He was a catastrophist over long ages. Some of the early Christian enthusiasts about Cuvier's theory believed that the last of these catastrophes was Noah's flood, because Cuvier dated it at about 5,000 years, but he didn't actually explicitly make that connection in his book. And then Smith developed the method of using fossils to date the rocks. He was also a catastrophist. And then Lyell was the uniformitarian and expanded Earth history even more. And then there were two very, very influential British geologists who held to both the catastrophist and uniformitarian view. William Buckland was professor of geology at Oxford University. He was also an ordained clergyman in the Anglican Church, so highly respected academically as well as religiously. And initially, he was a catastrophist, but under the influence of Charles Lyell in the 1830s, mid-1830s, he recanted his belief in catastrophism and became a uniformitarian. The same story is repeated with Adam Sedgwick, who was the chief geologist at Cambridge University. He also was an ordained Anglican, and because of their clerical status, they had a tremendous influence on the church. He too initially was a catastrophist, and then under the influence of Lyell, recanted and became a uniformitarian. So let's review where we've come from so far in terms of some graphs. The catastrophist view that really reigned in geology for about 30 years, the first 3 decades of the 19th century, a beginning. Most of the catastrophists, I think all of the catastrophists at this time were theists. They believed in some kind of God, but most of them were very vague in their writings, so you didn't really know exactly what they believed, but they clearly were not atheists. And then you see periodically over the course of long ages, millions of years, there were these regional or global catastrophes that produced some geological deposits with those fossils, and then things leading up to the present time. That view was replaced from about 1830 on, or by 1840 it was pretty well abandoned by the uniformitarian view, Hutton and Lyell. And you can see on the line here, there's no C's because they ruled out any regional or global catastrophes before they ever looked at the rocks. They said we must explain everything by present processes operating at present rates, intensities, and frequencies. So no regional or global catastrophes can be called in to explain what we're observing. And then those two views were opposed by the scriptural geologists, who were the object of my PhD thesis, and they contended for the biblical traditional view of a supernatural creation week of 6 literal days about 6,000 years ago, followed about 1,600 years later by the flood. And they believed that the flood was responsible for most of the geological record, and then the earth recovered from that, and things continued up to the present time. Now, the scriptural geologists were not the only Christians who responded to these old earth theories. Many, many other Christians began to say, okay, the millions of years is a fact. Maybe the catastrophists are right, maybe the uniformitarians are right, but we've got to reinterpret the Bible. And so in this period, we see various compromise positions that developed. Thomas Chalmers was very influential. He was a very gifted preacher, Presbyterian minister, and a naturalist. And at the age of 24, in his first pulpit in 1804, he began to advocate the gap theory and said that the Bible doesn't really say how old the earth is. It says that man is recent, but we can fit those millions of years in the gap between verse 1 and verse 2 of Genesis 1. That view was really the dominant view for the next 50 years as the church Christians tried to harmonize the Bible with millions of years. But George Stanley Faber was an Anglican theologian, well-respected and evangelical, and he didn't like the gap theory, and so he began to defend in 1823 in a book he wrote, the day-age theory, saying that the days are long ages, and then if we do that, then we harmonize the Bible with what the geologists are saying. This was not widely accepted because anyone who knew very much about what the geologists were saying about the sequence of events in history in terms of when creatures appeared knew that the order of events in the geological record, as they understood it at that time, was inconsistent with or contradicted the order of events in Genesis. So most people favored the gap theory instead of the day-age theory, until another man came along by the name of Hugh Miller. Hugh Miller was a geologist. He was a Scottish Presbyterian, a layman, and initially he favored the gap theory, but just before his death, sadly by suicide, he switched over to the day-age theory. And because of the respect that he had in the Christian community, many people began to embrace the day-age theory. And so from about 1850 onwards, the day-age and the gap view are kind of competing views within the church. But not only did people have to reinterpret Genesis 1 to try to fit the millions of years into the Bible, they also had to do something with Genesis 6 to 9, which describes the flood. And so John Fleming was a Presbyterian minister and a zoologist. He was an evangelical. And he began to propose the tranquil flood view in the 1820s. In fact, he had some influence on Charles Lyell. And they both advocated that Noah's flood was tranquil. It was so peaceful it left no geological evidence. And the proof of that is that the biblical account says that Noah sent out the dove and it came back with an olive leaf in its beak, and that just shows that it was so peaceful the plants weren't even damaged. I mean, it's just obvious. John Pye Smith had another solution. He was a congregational theologian, and in the 1830s he argued for the local creation and local flood view. Genesis 1 is describing a local creation in the Mesopotamian valley, and Genesis 6 and 9 is describing a local flood in the Mesopotamian valley. So those were views from conservative Christians, and then the other view that was developing at this time was the liberal view, and the liberals, of course, said, you guys are all wrong. Genesis 1 to 11 is mythology. Just like the ancient Babylonian creation and flood myth, the ancient Assyrians, etc. And so that was the view of liberal theologians, held at bay in England and North America because of the influence of the great evangelical awakening under the Wesleys and Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, but starting to seep into England from the continent, Germany and France particularly, in the 1830s. So let's summarize then. In the early 1800s, you had these various compromised views with old Earth geology. From the 1810s, the gap theory was really being advanced through the power